Imagine standing inside a packed civic hall in the summer of 479 BCE. Not on a battlefield, no swords, no spears, no shouts from an enemy army. Only Athenian men, those who called themselves citizens of the first democracy in history, were arguing over the future of their city. Then one man stands up. His name is Lycidas. He does not call for surrender. He does not praise Persia. He says only one thing, one sentence that is entirely reasonable in that moment. Perhaps we should listen to the Persian offer of peace. No one boos, no one argues back. There is no vote. The men around him quietly step forward, surround him, and stone Lycidas to death on the floor of the hall. The debate ends in the most literal way possible, but it doesn't stop there. When the news spreads outside, the women of Athens march to Lycidas's house, drag his wife and children into the street, and stone them to death as well, not because they are dangerous, but because they carry the same name. This is not a legend. This is Greece in 479 BCE. And that moment tells us everything we need to know about the world that is about to walk into the Battle of Plataea. A few months earlier, 300 Spartan warriors had died at Thermopylae. They died cleanly. They died beautifully. They died in the way people like to remember war. But while history's gaze was fixed on that narrow pass, Athens had been emptied, occupied, and burned not once, but twice. Temples collapsed. Statues of the gods were blackened by fire. Homes turned to ash. The Athenians no longer had a city to defend. They had only memories to avenge. They lived on ships. They slept beside orphaned children. They breathed old smoke mixed with the smell of fresh corpses. And when people are pushed into that state, they lose all tolerance for hesitation. They lose patience for a reason. In that world, dissent is no longer a civic right. It becomes a crime. That is why Lycidas had to die, not because he was wrong, but because he spoke too late in a society that had already decided peace itself was a form of betrayal. The Persian king Xerxes had left Greece after his naval defeat, but he did not leave in despair. He left behind Mardonius, his cousin, his finest general, along with an elite army selected from hundreds of thousands. Athens knew this. They understood the war was not over. It had only shifted from noise to tension, and in that state, fear becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. Athens looked south toward the Peloponnese, where Sparta sat motionless behind the walls of the isthmus. Sparta, the city of discipline, honor, and heavy infantry, was waiting, not waiting to fight, but waiting to see how far Athens would fall. To Sparta, an Athens that was burned but still alive was a future rival. An utterly destroyed city was a political lesson for the rest of Greece. So Athens did not beg, they threatened. They sent envoys to Sparta with a cold message. If Sparta did not march immediately, Athens would open negotiations with Persia. And if the Athenian fleet switched sides, the isthmus wall would become meaningless. This was not desperation, it was leverage. For the first time since the invasion began, Sparta had no safe choice. Either march north and face Mardonius, or sit still and wait for their turn. That night, as the sun set behind the hills of the Peloponnese, the Spartan ephors ordered full mobilization. No ritual, no speeches, only commands. And when Sparta moved, it did not move halfway. No advanced detachment, no symbolic force. They pulled nearly their entire military strength out of the city. 5,000 Spartiates, 7 slaves for each man, 35,000 helots, armed and driven forward. A massive column vanished into the night before Athens could even complain. The next morning, Athenian envoys arrived to confront the Spartan ephors and were met with a single sentence. "You are too late. The army is already on the road. The hunt had begun." But what no one realized at the time was this Plataea would not be the story of Greece saving itself. It would be the story of the moment Greece accepted, becoming the very thing it claimed to hate. While the Spartan army was moving silently through the night, there was a truth the Athenians would only understand later, when it was already too late. Sparta was not acting for Athens, and it was not acting for Greece. Sparta was acting for Sparta. Before the ultimatum, before even the threat of negotiating with Persia, Athens had appealed to Sparta again and again. Envoys were sent. Obligations of alliance were invoked. Oaths sworn to defend Greece against foreign invasion were repeated. But from the south, the answer was always the same weight. The reasons changed with each request. One time it was a religious festival. Another time the omens were unfavorable. Another time the army was not yet ready. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own until you placed them side by side and realized the pattern. Sparta was deliberately buying time, not because they feared Persia. Sparta never feared war. What they feared was a victorious Athens, an Athens rebuilt, an Athens grateful but also empowered, armed with a fleet trade networks and a flexibility Sparta would never possess. In the eyes of the ephors, the ideal Athens was wounded enough to depend on Sparta, but never strong enough to challenge it. In Sparta's calculations, Greece did not need to be united. A divided Greece dependent on Spartan infantry was the most stable configuration for long-term power. Persia was an external threat. Athens was the internal problem. That is why when Athens was burned the first time, Sparta remained behind the walls of the isthmus. When Athens was burned a second time, Sparta still waited. They observed. They measured. They allowed despair in the north to ripen like fruit that should not be harvested too early. Sparta did not ask, "Should we save Athens?" They asked, "How far will Athens fall if we do nothing?" But this time, Athens refused to play the role of a compliant victim. When every moral appeal vanished into silence, they turned to something Sparta understood perfectly: leverage. The message sent to the ephors was brief and emotionless, cold as iron. If Sparta continued to stand still, Athens would open negotiations with Persia, not because they trusted Persia, but because they knew how much Sparta feared that outcome. An Athenian defection meant the strongest Greek fleet falling into enemy hands. It meant every land wall became irrelevant. It meant the war would no longer be decided by men in red cloaks, but by ships off the Peloponnesian coast. That was a future Sparta could not control. For the first time since Xerxes set foot in Greece, Sparta was forced to react, not out of honor, but out of fear of losing strategic dominance. And at that moment, Sparta was finally confronted with its real choice: honor or power. If they continued to wait and Athens collapsed, Sparta would face a Persia unchallenged at sea. If they marched, they might save Greece, but they would also save Athens, planting the seeds of a future rival. This was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between two dangerous outcomes, differing only in which one allowed Sparta to remain at the center. The decision was not made in daylight, not before the public, not accompanied by speeches about freedom. It was made in silence. As the sun set, the ephors studied the shadows, not to consult the gods, but to calculate timing. Then they issued the order. Sparta would march, but they would not declare that they were saving Athens. They would declare that they were defending Greece. The distinction sounded minor. It was not. It allowed them to retain the narrative, preserve the authority to define victory, and most importantly, maintain leadership without owing gratitude to anyone. That is why the mobilization happened at night. No war drums, no heroic summons, only orders transmitted with bureaucratic efficiency. 5,000 Spartiates were called up. The helot lists were read not to honor names, but to ensure numbers. 7 per warrior. No more, no less. Enough to carry supplies, enough to die in place of their masters. When Athens awoke the next morning, they believed they had won the negotiation. Sparta was marching. What they did not realize was that in this unspoken bargain, Athens was not the winner. They were merely the side that had not yet lost. Sparta, by stepping out of the Peloponnese at precisely the right moment, had transformed a rescue into a political investment. The war ahead, regardless of how it ended, would no longer be a simple story of Greece versus Persia. It had become a power struggle where every move carried long-term intent. And as the Spartan army advanced north, They carried more than shields and spears. They carried an ambition carefully hidden beneath red cloaks, an ambition that would only reveal itself once enough blood had been spilled. Plataea lay ahead, but the true betrayal had already begun behind them. The army left the Peloponnese in the night, without horns, without drums, without promises. Thin moonlight spilled across stone roads, glinting faintly off bronze and steel. 45,000 people moved as a single breathing shadow, stretching from the gates of Sparta to the northern mountain passes. It was a sight large enough to convince anyone that history itself was shifting. But if you looked closely, you would see that this history was being carried by hands that would never be named. 10,000 Spartiates marched at the front. They carried round shields, long spears, and dark red cloaks meant to hide blood. These were the men every later story would remember, trained from childhood to keep their hands steady while killing. Behind them followed 35,000 helots, hastily armed, burdened with supplies, tools, provisions, and fear compressed across generations. 7 helots for every Spartan. The number was not symbolic. It was calculated logistical. No more, no less. No one read their names. No one asked whether they were willing. Helots swore no oath. They were promised no freedom, no glory, not even survival. They were ordered to march, and they marched because refusal meant death on the spot. To Sparta, helots were not citizens and not soldiers. They were resources, expendable assets, to be consumed in exchange for the safety of those called free. The column passed through silent fields and villages not yet awake. Somewhere dogs barked at the moving shadows. Somewhere else a door quietly closed, not out of fear of Persia, but out of fear of the men passing through. War before meeting the enemy had already begun by teaching people to look away. With every mile, the difference between the two halves of the army became sharper. The Spartans marched evenly, silently, treating movement as ritual. The helots stumbled their burden, not only supplies, but uncertainty. They understood one truth clearly. If victory came, it would not belong to them. If defeat came, the first bodies left on the road would not carry their names. History's storytellers rarely linger on details like these, but to understand Plataea, you have to look behind the shield wall. You have to see those who were never allowed to hope for more than surviving one more day, those for whom war was not a choice, but an unavoidable disaster. Sparta called this march a duty. Athens would later call it salvation, but to the helots, it was a massive forced relocation, tearing them away from fields, families, and whatever fragments of ordinary life remained. There were no farewell songs for them, no wishes of victory, only the sound of metal striking metal, and a pace that did not allow slowing. As the army approached the border of Boeotia, the land began to change. The ground grew drier, the roads widened. Hills opened into plains where war had nowhere to hide. For the Spartiates, this was familiar ground terrain where the phalanx thrived. For the helots, it was exposure, open space, with nowhere to disappear if everything went wrong. Here the question grew heavier, clearer, impossible to avoid. If this were a war for Greek freedom, where was the freedom of those carrying the war itself? If Plataea was the moment Greece rose against foreign oppression, when would internal oppression be addressed? Or was it merely postponed, set aside long enough to destroy a greater enemy, only to return to the weaker once the killing was done? No one in the column stopped to answer. War does not permit such questions. It demands motion, and so they kept moving, crossing dry stream beds and narrow paths into land that would later be known by a single name, Plataea. Ahead of them, Mardonius was waiting with a professional army cavalry archers and a battlefield chosen with care. But at this moment, before the two sides saw each other before the first arrow was loosed, the tragedy was already in place. It did not lie in tactics or terrain. It lay in the fact that a war celebrated as a fight for freedom began by sending tens of thousands of unfree people to the front line of history. When the Spartan army entered Boeotia, Daylight finally caught up with them. Darkness peeled away, revealing the full scale of the force advancing north. Shield lines gleamed, exhausted faces emerged, and far ahead, across the wide plain, Persian tents began to rise into view like a city made of cloth and wood. Two worlds were moving toward each other, but only one would be remembered by name. While the Greek army advanced into Boeotia, Mardonius was already waiting on the far side of the plain, not waiting in panic, not waiting in anger. He waited like a hunter, seated before a trap already set, needing only a few more steps from the prey. Greek history often portrays Mardonius as a mere extension of Xerxes, a foreign arrogant Persian general, driving masses of slaves forward with whips. But that is the version told by the victors. In reality, Mardonius was nothing like the king who had left Greece in bitterness. He did not crave spectacle. He did not need a throne on a hill to watch men die, and he did not believe in hiding weakness behind numbers. When Xerxes withdrew after defeat at sea, Mardonius was given a choice. He could retreat as well, preserve his safety, and report that the campaign was no longer viable. Instead, he stayed, not out of recklessness, but because he understood Greece in a way few Persians ever had. He knew they were not a unified people. He knew they distrusted one another. And above all, he knew that Greece's greatest danger was not courage, but division disguised as lofty talk of freedom. Mardonius did not retain the massive host that had once shaken Asia. He kept only what was sharpest. Professional infantry, mobile cavalry, archers trained to fire not by impulse, but by command. This was not a parade army. It was a weapon refined to its most efficient form. Then there was Athens. The city had been abandoned, occupied, and burned. When Mardonius entered it a second time, there was no great battle and no serious resistance. He could have held Athens as a hostage. He could have turned it into a logistical base. Instead, he chose differently. He ordered everything that remained, destroyed temples, houses, walls, not in fury, but in calculation. To Mardonius, Athens was not merely a city. It was a symbol. It was the place Greeks clung to as proof that there was something left to return to. He understood that if you want an enemy to fight desperately, you give them hope. But if you want them to make mistakes, you take that hope away. By turning Athens into a field of blackened stone, Mardonius did more than destroy buildings. He erased the memory of return. He forced the Greeks to fight not to defend homes, but to avenge something that no longer existed. After that, he withdrew northward, not as a retreat, but as an invitation. He chose the plain of Plataea near the Asopus River and close to Thebes, a city loyal to Persia. The terrain was no accident. It was wide, flat, and open, perfect for cavalry and archers. It was a nightmare for the heavy Greek phalanx, powerful in direct collision, but slow to maneuver. There, Mardonius constructed a fortified camp, nearly a city of war. Wooden palisades, watchtowers, supply depots. A base secure enough to avoid surprise attack, and close enough to apply constant pressure. He was not in a hurry. He did not need victory in a single day. He only needed Greece to make a mistake. When news reached him that the Spartan army had entered Boeotia, Mardonius did not panic. He smiled. At last, the men in red cloaks had left the Peloponnese. At last, the war he wanted had begun, but not in the way Greek songs would later describe it, not with a heroic charge, but with a prolonged contest of minds, where patience itself was the most lethal weapon. Mardonius knew he could not force battle in narrow streets or broken terrain. He also knew the Greeks would not be foolish enough to descend onto the plain immediately. So he waited. He allowed the two armies to study one another from a distance. The Greeks clung to the hills, holding safe ground. The Persians spread across the valley below a silent challenge. This was the position Mardonius wanted. A battlefield without major clashes, but heavy with pressure, heat, thirst, hunger, weapons that required no swords to kill. He understood that time favored him. Each day, without decision, strained Greek discipline. Their fragile alliance would begin to fracture, and when that happened, he would not need to defeat a united army. He would only need to destroy it piece by piece. To the north, the Greek army finally halted. Looking down at the plain, they did not see a chaotic horde, but a war machine arranged with care, confident ordered, and in no hurry. The two forces stood within sight of one another like predators measuring distance. No one attacked. No one withdrew. Only a long, oppressive silence stretched between them, warning that when blood finally flowed, it would not be spilled because of tactical error, but because human endurance had been pushed beyond its limit. The stalemate was set. And in that stillness, Mardonius had gained what he wanted most control over the rhythm of the war. The war did not begin with trumpets, but with the sun. August in Boeotia was merciless. The light did not shine down. It pressed. It pressed against bronze helmets, against armor, against shields, laid on the ground so hot they burned the hand on contact. On the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, the Greek army stood still, staring down at the plain of Plataea, as one looks into a trap, already sprung where every step forward might be the last. Mardonius was not in a hurry. He did not need a quick battle. He needed time, and time in ancient warfare was a silent killer. Water became more precious than blood. Shade is more valuable than honor. Each day without combat shaved discipline thinner wore patience down another layer. Below on the plain, the Persian camp lived and moved. Horses were fed. Bows were checked. Cavalry practiced short maneuvers, as if to remind the enemy that they were exactly where they wanted to be. On the hillside, the Greeks remained motionless. They could not descend. The open ground was death for the heavy phalanx, but they could not withdraw either without breaking their own spirit. Then the Persian cavalry began to appear, not for a full assault, just harassment, fast rides, arrows lofted high, falling like light rain, not enough to shatter formations, but enough to kill a few men each day, enough to remind them that no position was truly safe. Flies gathered around bodies not yet buried. Sweat mixed with the smell of heated metal in the thickening air. During one of these probes, Mecistius appeared. He was the Persian cavalry commander, a giant of a man riding a Nisaean horse unmistakable, in gleaming armor and unhidden confidence. He led his riders close to the slope, close enough to mock, close enough to provoke. Arrows fell among the Greek ranks. Laughter drifted up from below. Then in a rare moment of chaos, Mecistius was thrown from his horse. Not because of brilliant tactics, not because of perfect planning, simply because an arrow struck the galloping animal. When Mecistius hit the ground, the Greeks surged forward as if released from prolonged paralysis. They surrounded him, hacking and thrusting blows, glancing uselessly off finely crafted Persian armor. Only when a spear was driven through the narrow opening at the eye did Mecistius finally fall. His death unleashed a wave of emotion that the Greeks had been starving for. They dragged his body away, displayed it like a trophy. For a brief moment, they believed it was a sign that the gods favored them, that Persia could bleed. Cheers erupted along the hillside, short, violent like a drowning man breaking the surface for one breath. But the hope did not last. Mardonius saw the body of Mecistius and did not rage. He did not rush to avenge him. He simply changed the rhythm. Cavalry was ordered to stop the meaningless harassment. Instead, they struck what Greek shields and spears could not protect: logistics. Supply convoys from the Peloponnese were intercepted. Mountain paths were sealed. Then came the water. Persian horsemen rode directly to the Gargaphia spring, the main water source for the Greek army. They trampled its banks, churned mud into the flow, turning clear water into something undrinkable. No major battle was required. Just a few hours. An army of tens of thousands began to thirst. Day after day, the sun rose and set like an accomplice. Arrows continued to fall sporadically. The dead were pulled to the rear more quietly now. The Greek alliance, built on oaths and temporary interests, began to crack. City-states whispered. Who should attack? Who should retreat? Who was bearing the worst of it? No one spoke loudly, but suspicion spread faster than any army. Pausanias saw it clearly. He understood that the most dangerous enemy now was not Mardonius, but exhaustion. An army without water cannot fight. A tired alliance collapses before the enemy needs to strike. Yet he also knew that descending onto the plain would be suicide. The situation was locked, and every option led to disaster by a different path. By the 8th day, then the 9th endurance reached its limit. Water was nearly gone, rations were tightened, complaints were no longer contained. Commanders began to argue. Spartan discipline held the right wing in place, but elsewhere confidence was eroding by the hour. At last Pausanias made the decision. He knew history would judge harshly. Not to attack, not to surrender, but to withdraw. Not a daytime flight, but an organized retreat at night toward ground closer to the mountains, where water remained and formations could be restored. It was a decision filled with risk, but at that moment, it was the only way to keep the army alive until morning. Orders were passed in silence. Torches were extinguished. Shields were lifted as lightly as possible. 45,000 men prepared to leave their positions without alerting the enemy. The war without battle had lasted long enough, and now, in the darkness, even the smallest mistake could turn withdrawal into catastrophe. When the order to withdraw was passed, there was no loud protest, only exchanged looks in the darkness, slow nods, hands tightening around shield straps. In theory, the plan was simple: leave the current position, move to a safer defensive point closer to the mountains, and water maintain formation wait for daylight. But war does not unfold on paper. It unfolds at night among exhausted, dehydrated men who have gone too long without sleep. At the second watch of the night, the army began to move. No drums, no torches, no shouted commands. Only the scrape of armor against leather boots crunching over dry stone, heavy breathing forced into silence. 45,000 men attempted the most difficult maneuver in war, retreating with an enemy close enough to hear them breathe. From the beginning, the plan began to unravel. In the center, where contingents from Corinth, Megara, and other allied city-states were positioned, discipline did not resemble Sparta's. When the signal came, they did not withdraw step by step. They turned and walked fast, then faster, then nearly ran. No one ordered panic, but fear spread on its own. One quickened his pace, pulling another with him. Formations stretched, gaps opened, and once they could no longer see the ranks beside them in the dark, they kept moving. They did not stop at the designated position. They did not turn back to check. They went straight toward the town of Plataea, gathering around the temple of Hera like lost people searching for shelter. In a matter of hours, more than half of the Greek force had removed itself from the battlefield, not by command, but by fear left unnamed. On the left wing, the Athenians began their withdrawal according to plan, only to realize that the forces meant to be beside them had vanished. In the darkness, no one knew what was happening. Athens could not see Sparta. Sparta could not see Athens. Hills cut the formation apart, and silence became the greatest enemy. They halted, waiting for a signal. None came. On the right wing where the Spartans stood, the problem was not fear. It was an honor. When the order reached him, Amphiaraus, commander of an elite unit, refused. He stood motionless in the darkness among his men and told Pausanias that he would not retreat before the enemy. To him, stepping backward was not a tactic. It was a disgrace. He invoked Thermopylae. He spoke of men who had died without yielding ground. In his world, there was no distinction between a tactical withdrawal and a rout. Pausanias tried to explain. He said this was not a flight, but a repositioning. He said that if they remained, they would die of thirst. But words could not penetrate the Spartan conditioning carved into Amphiaraus since childhood. For him, victory existed only in advance or in standing firm. There was no third option. The argument unfolded on the battlefield itself in the darkness, while tens of thousands were trying to move in silence. Voices were low, but the tension was not. Finally, Amphiaraus bent down. lifted a large stone from the dry stream bed and hurled it to the ground at Pausanias's feet. With this stone, he said, I cast my vote not to retreat. That was how Spartans voted, and he had turned it into an open act of defiance. Pausanias stood between two opposing forces. On one side, the strategy and the survival of the entire alliance. On the other hand, Spartan honor, which he could not openly violate without undermining his own authority. He had no time. Dawn was approaching. At last he made the decision no commander ever wants to make. He ordered the rest of the Spartan force to continue withdrawing, leaving Amompharetus and his unit behind. He hoped that when Amompharetus realized he was truly being abandoned, he would relent and follow. It was a gamble staked with thousands of lives. In the darkness, the Spartan column began to move slowly, constantly looking back. And just as Pausanias had anticipated, when Amompharetus understood that he would indeed be left alone to face the Persian army, he ordered his men forward. But by then it was too late. The line had stretched. The order had been lost. To the east, the sky began to pale. Birds started to sing. The faint contours of the plain emerged, and at the same moment, across the river, Persian sentries looked up at the hillside and saw something impossible. The Greek position was empty. The center was gone. Athens was nowhere to be seen, and the men in red cloaks were exposed, strung out, disordered, no longer in a defensive posture. Mardonius stepped out of his tent. He did not need further reconnaissance. In his eyes, there was no tactical withdrawal, only an army in flight. He laughed, mocking Sparta's reputation. These are the men who never retreat, he said. Look at them. He did not wait for perfect formation. He did not craft a complex plan. He gave the order at once. Cavalry crossed the river. Infantry followed, not like an army, but like a pack of hunters released from the leash. On the hillside, Pausanias turned and heard the sound first. Not voices. The ground itself is trembling. A wall of dust is rising on the horizon. He saw the nightmare advancing. Athens was too far away. The center was gone. Allies hid behind city walls. Only the Spartan force remained stretched thin, unprepared, exposed. The sun rose above the horizon, illuminating the full, brutal truth of the situation. The night Greece lost itself was over, and the morning of Plataea had begun. That morning arrived in the late summer of 479 BCE as the Boeotian sun lifted above the horizon and began to scorch the plain of Plataea like a slab of heated metal. No date was carved into stone. No chronicle recorded the exact hour, but for the men standing on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron that day, time did not need numbers. It was measured in heartbeats, in sweat pooling beneath bronze helmets, and in the crushing heat that weighed on the lungs with every breath. The morning light revealed everything. The Greek center was gone. The Athenian left wing was no longer where it was meant to be, and stretched across the exposed slopes, the Spartans stood elongated, disordered, unable to reform in time. Not a complete phalanx, not a prepared army. Just lines of men emerging from a night-long mistake they could not undo. Across the Asopus River, the response was almost immediate. Mardonius did not summon a council. He did not send scouts. He stepped out of his tent, looked through the thin mist clinging to the plain, and understood that the moment he had waited for had arrived. In his eyes, there was no tactical withdrawal, only an enemy exposed, exhausted, and divided. The order was given briefly. No trumpets, no shouting. Tens of thousands of Persian archers advanced, planting their wicker shields into the ground, forming a crude wall sufficient to shelter their bodies. Behind that barrier, they drew their bows, one by one, with the practiced precision of ritual drilled 100 times before. Then the sky over Plataea darkened, not from clouds, but from arrows. The rain of shafts fell on the hillside, in measured waves, not chaotic, not hurried. Arrows arced high and plunged down like metal rain, slamming into shields, glancing off helmets, slipping through the narrow gaps. Armor could not seal. The clash of metal echoed everywhere, mixed with the suppressed groans of men struck but not yet fallen. Pausanias gave the order to halt. Do not advance. Do not retreat. Stand fast. In that moment, the command sounded like a sentence. Soldiers knelt behind their shields, feeling each impact travel through their arms, each arrow vibrating against bronze. They were forbidden to charge, forbidden to break formation, and behind the shield wall, the first to die were not Spartiates, but helots. The helots wore no heavy armor. They had no large round shields to cover the body. They were equipped enough to support not enough to endure sustained arrow fire. Persian arrows did not distinguish between master and slave, but the results did. Helots fell faster, in greater numbers. They collapsed behind the ranks, trampled in disciplined chaos, their cries swallowed by the clash of metal in the trembling ground. In the midst of the killing rain, Pausanias turned his back on the enemy. He called for a priest. A goat was dragged into the line. A blade cut its throat. Blood spilled onto dry earth, evaporating in the early heat. The liver was removed, lifted, and examined with ritual care. The signs were bad. The gods did not permit battle. The order remained wait. Arrows continued to fall. Helots continued to die. A Spartan was struck in the neck and collapsed. He was dragged to the rear, blood soaking his red cloak, darker still. The rest stood motionless, teeth clenched sweat, mixed with dust and blood eyes, fixed on the shields ahead. A second goat was brought forward. The ritual repeated. The liver was still unfavorable. Pausanias shook his head. Wait. Time stretched until it lost meaning. No one knew how long it had been since the first arrow fell. Only that every second of stillness was its own battle against instinct, the instinct to charge, to flee, to shatter discipline, just to live a few more breaths. On the flank, the Tegeans began to stir. They were not trained for Spartan-style endurance. They shifted. They whispered. Some ranks began to move, ready to charge, despite knowing it might bring faster death. Pausanias saw it and ordered them to hold. His voice was not loud, but no one disobeyed. In a rare moment, he lifted his eyes toward the distant temple of Hera, on the hill behind Plataea. Later accounts say he prayed, not for victory, but for permission to fight. He begged the gods not to let them die here, standing still beneath arrow fire, without ever using the hands they had trained for war their entire lives. Persian arrows fell closer. Wicker shields were pushed forward. A few Persian soldiers advanced, firing and shouting taunts. "Come out and fight," they screamed. "Is this Sparta?" A third goat was brought forward. The blade fell again. The liver was raised in the sharpening morning light. Pausanias studied it longer, much longer. Then he stood upright. There was no speech, no trumpet call. He simply raised his spear. The order surged through the ranks like electricity. Men sprang up from their knees. Shields rose, spears leveled. All the tension compressed through days of thirst, through a night of chaos, through a morning of standing beneath arrows, was released in a single instant. The Spartan phalanx began to move, not walking, not running, but surging. They poured down the slope like a living mass of bronze boots hammering the earth into a single heavy rhythm that could not be mistaken. The distance between the two armies collapsed rapidly. Arrows still fell, but there was no longer time to kill one man at a time. Wicker shields began to shudder, then splinter under the pressure of a wall advancing without pause. The surviving helots ran behind them, gasping for breath, mixing with the roar held in check for too long. There were no more sacrifices, no omens, no waiting, only movement, and the collision are about to occur. When the front of the phalanx slammed into the Persian shield wall, there was no romantic clash of steel, only the crack of breaking wood bodies hurled backward, and the sound of air bursting from lungs as the weight of bronze and flesh collided. The late summer morning of 479 BCE was no longer merciful, and from that moment on, Plataea was no longer a battle between two armies. It became a machine just switched on. The first impact did not sound like steel meeting steel. It sounded like wood being crushed like bone, colliding with bone, like a temporary wall collapsing under a mass that had nowhere left to stop. The Persian wicker shields shattered almost instantly, not because the men holding them were weak, but because what was coming at them was no longer human in the ordinary sense. It was a block of bronze with rhythm weight, inertia, and a single purpose to move forward. The Spartan phalanx did not pause to slash. It pushed, shoulders braced into shields, feet stepping in unison, rear ranks driving the front ranks ahead, turning the formation into a slow, unstoppable press of flesh. The Persians in the front line were lifted off their feet, forced backward, crushed underfoot, before they could understand what was happening. Screams were swallowed by the thunder of boots and ragged breath. There were no elegant duels here, only force. When spears broke, xiphus blades came out. Short, thick swords designed not for flourish, but for killing at arm's length. Face, throat, groin, places where Persian armor was never meant to withstand a straight thrust, powered by bronze and muscle trained since childhood. The Persians were not cowards. They surged forward, grabbed Spartan spears with bare hands, snapped wooden shafts, searched desperately for gaps. But courage could not defeat physics. Every Spartan strike followed the same brutal equation. Shield holds, blade drives, step forward. Helots flooded into the gaps behind them. The men who had died in droves beneath the arrow storm now became the second wave. No formation, no ritual, only the violent release of pressure stored for years. They used stones, knives, and light spears, killing those already down, those wounded, those who could no longer stand. Not from personal hatred, but because inside this machine, everything that moved went forward, and anything in the way was crushed. Dust rose so thick the horizon vanished. Men fought by silhouette, by sound, by instinct. Persian shouts, Greek cries, metal splintering wood, merged into a single mass of noise, stripped of meaning. And at the center of it all, Mardonius still stood. He rode a white horse, visible through the chaos like a fixed point. His purple cloak was smeared with dust and blood. Around him stood his elite bodyguard men, chosen to die before he did. Mardonius did not flee. He fought. He cut down any Spartan reckless enough to break formation and rush ahead alone. His presence held the Persian line together. As long as they could see the white horse, as long as the purple cloak remained upright, they believed order had not yet collapsed. The Spartans saw him too, and they understood something immediately. This was no longer a contest of endurance. It was a hunt. The phalanx shifted its weight inch by inch like a thinking organism. They ignored scattered gold. They did not stop to finish the fallen. They pressed toward the white horse. The distance closed over bodies. Persian guards fell one by one, forming a slick ramp of corpses the Spartans climbed over. Final attempts to shield the general turned desperate. Bodies were thrown into gaps to plug them. Horses were speared and brought down. Everything was sacrificed to buy Mardonius a few more heartbeats. Then Mardonius fell. The sources do not agree on how he died. Some say a spear through the chest. Others say a stone crushed his skull. The detail does not matter. What matters is the moment the white horse collapsed, and the man in the purple cloak did not rise again. In ancient warfare, some sounds exist for only a few seconds. The sound an army makes when it realizes its head has been cut off. Persian voices faltered. The line sagged. Men who were not yet dead turned searching for orders no one could give. And on the edge of the battlefield, Artabazus saw everything. He commanded a massive reserve large enough to change the outcome, if committed at the right moment. He saw the phalanx grinding through the center. He saw banners in disarray. He saw Mardonius lying still. And he did what survivors do. He ordered a withdrawal. Not back to camp, out of Greece. 40,000 men turned and vanished from the battle, leaving behind an army without leadership, without cohesion, and without escape. This was not cowardice. It was the cold arithmetic of a man who understood that the fight had crossed from warfare into slaughter. The remaining Persians fled towards their fortified camp, the wooden walls they believed would save them. Gates slammed shut, towers filled with men, From above, arrows rained down on Spartans gathering below. For a brief moment, it seemed this might become a final refuge. Then the Athenians arrived. Unlike Sparta, Athens understood siege warfare. They did not stand beneath arrows without purpose. They broke walls. They forced openings. And when a section of the wooden barrier collapsed, what poured inside was not strategy. It was uncontrolled fury. No prisoners were taken. No pleas were heard. Men cornered were killed where they stood. Men who dropped weapons were killed all the same. The camp became a sealed space where violence had nowhere to drain away. Earth mixed with blood, turning into thick mud underfoot. Men slipped, rose, and killed again. The casualty numbers recorded later sound exaggerated. The field did not need numbers. It spoke in the metallic stench of the air, in a spreading silence as screams finally ceased. When all movement stopped, when the killing machine ran out of fuel, a strange emptiness settled in. There were no cheers, no victory songs, only men standing among corpses, gasping, looking around, as if waking from a long delirium. The late summer sun still shone over Plataea, unchanged from that morning. Wind moved through torn tents. Banners lay on the ground. The massacre was over, and what remained was not glory, only silence. The silence after the killing did not last long. It never does. It always gives way to the footsteps of the living and to the sound of metal striking metal as bodies are searched. On the field of Plataea, where only hours earlier a massive machine of destruction had been operating, the Greeks began to grasp the second truth of victory. They were standing in the middle of a fortune. The Persian camp was more than a military encampment. It was a mobile palace, great tents draped in deep purple cloth, thick carpets, silver tables, golden basins, food, wine, textiles, jewelry. For Spartans raised on austerity, accustomed to black broth, so thick outsiders recoiled from it. The scene felt like stepping into a world that did not belong to them. Pausanias entered Mardonius's tent, still wearing armor stained with blood. He looked around slowly, deliberately touching nothing. Persian cooks, men who had not escaped or had not been allowed to cower in the corner waiting to die. Pausanias did not kill them. He ordered them to cook, not a simple meal, the exact feast they would have prepared for the Persian general. The meat was roasted, bread was baked, wine was poured, spices filled the air, already heavy with smoke and blood. When the feast was ready, Pausanias turned to his own Spartan cooks and gave a second order prepare a standard Spartan meal. Pork blood and vinegar are boiled into a dark, viscous broth. The two meals were placed side by side. Pausanias summoned the commanders. He pointed to the Persian feast, then to the Spartan pot, and he laughed, not with joy, but with the bitter laughter of a man who understood too well the nature of the victory he had won. He said the Persians were fools to live in such luxury and come here to plunder men who possessed almost nothing. That sentence is what history remembers. What history rarely records is what followed the laughter. No one saw Pausanias taste the Persian feast that day, but from that moment on, what he had seen never left him. Victory not only opened a treasure before his eyes, it opened a door inside him, one that years of discipline and deprivation had kept tightly sealed. While the army was still dividing the spoils, other news arrived like a distant echo. Across the Aegean Sea, at nearly the same moment, Greek forces struck the Persian position at Mycale. Not a prolonged battle, but a finishing blow. The Persian fleet was burned. The base was destroyed. What remained of Persian power in the region was erased. The war ended, not with a treaty, but with the complete exhaustion of the enemy. Greece was saved, but saved from what and for what purpose was a question no one rushed to answer. As the armies dispersed and the city-states returned home, the alliance forged by shared fear began to loosen. The external enemy was gone, and like every alliance in history, once the common threat disappeared, attention turned inward. Athens returned to a city reduced to ash and began to rebuild, but this time not for defense, for dominance. Higher walls, a larger fleet. The Delian League emerged first in the name of protection, then gradually as an empire. Tribute replaced voluntary contribution. Power replaced ideals. Athens learned its lesson from Plataea. Not a lesson about freedom, but about strength. Sparta returned as a victor uncertain what to do with victory. Its austere life remained unchanged, its system intact, as if nothing had happened. But that was only the surface. Beneath it, cracks had formed. Pausanias, the hero of Plataea, was no longer the same man. He had mocked Persian luxury, then began to wear Persian robes. He had despised Eastern ritual, then came to enjoy being treated like a satrap. Rumors spread that he was communicating with former enemies, that he dreamed of power beyond what Sparta allowed. At first, no one believed it. How could the man who broke Persia betray Greece? But evidence accumulated. A changed lifestyle, foreign bodyguards, private conversations, vague promises to the helots of freedom, the most dangerous words a Spartan could ever speak. Eventually, those who had once praised him turned to hunting him. Pausanias fled, not from an external enemy, but from his own city. He ran into a temple, clinging to sacred law, as a final refuge. And Sparta, loyal to law above all else, did not kill him. They simply sealed the doors. Legend says the first stone placed to block the entrance was set by his own mother. She did not weep. She did not beg. She chose the city over her son. Pausanias starved in the darkness, dragged outside only at the last moment so as not to defile the sanctuary. The man who defeated Persia died as a traitor. No song was written for that ending. That is why people prefer to remember Thermopylae over Plataea. Thermopylae is clean. 300 men die at the right moment. They do not live long enough to be tempted to fail to grow complicated. They die as symbols. Plataea is different. Plataea is dirty. Plataea is loud. Plataea is full of contradictions. Good men commit brutal acts. Heroes decay. Victory turns into power, and power always demands payment. Thermopylae gave Greece a story to tell. Plataea gave it the power to rule, and history as always proves that humans rarely understand what they are trading for what.